Hi, Dan Alasso again with History for Today. Next fall, I am teaching a 4,000 level class in historiography for the first time. I've taken historiography surveys at both the master's and the PhD levels at first Mankato State University and then later at the University of Massachusetts. And I've done historiographies for each of my teaching fields. But I haven't taught it to undergrads yet. And actually, it has only been done once last year at Bemidji State when my colleague John taught it as an experimental class as we were preparing to add it to the catalog. So just as history is the study of change over time, historiography is the study of change over time in history. Historiography studies the changes in the accounts and the narratives and the interpretations of the past by different people, societies, and cultures. Historiography also provides us with an opportunity to keep track of the various subdisciplines of history, which even within a given culture or a period may focus on different groups or events or causes and use different types of sources and evidence. So a background in historiography helps the historian understand that there is not a single right answer in history. The past really includes an infinite number of moments and events, and they can be viewed from a nearly infinite number of perspectives and connected in a wide variety of ways. If you think of the past as a great forest, similar to the way I kind of think of my notes, then any particular history is a single path through it. And then historiography studies the relationship between the forest and those various paths. Paths are all going somewhere. The forest really is not. So it's often much more legitimate to ask what was the goal or the meaning of that particular history than to try to find a meaning for the past. So all that being said, I have several texts in mind that I want to have my students read from, book passages and articles. But since a big part of the subject is understanding how historians approach to the past, how their interest and how their assumptions and, dare I say it, their biases have changed over time, I thought I would dig into some of the books on my university library shelves to discover and then to help illustrate that point. The BSU library holds a lot of history books, many of which are distributed across the shelves in different places, depending on what they happen to be histories of. But in the back corner on the fourth floor, there's a bookshelf filled with historiographies, as well as with books about writing history, teaching history, that sort of thing. And I'm taking some time this summer to sit in the carrel right next to that shelf and pick up every one of them and see what they're about. Some of them really aren't relevant to my current project, and I may return to them in the future. Others just aren't interesting to me at all. But some of them do offer interesting glimpses into just what I'm looking for. Historians self-consciously discussing their work and the work of their peers. So when I find one of these books, I grab it and I check it out. I bring it back to my office across campus where I have a flatbed scanner that I can use to copy the chapters that I want to read. Very rarely I'll decide that I need to actually have the whole book, and then I usually buy it on Abe Books. As a matter of fact, I just ordered an old hardcover copy of Carl Becker's book, Every Man His Own Historian, Essays on History and Politics. I sort of have a soft spot for Becker. But that's one of the interesting things about this bookshelf full of old volumes. They're not just random. They were chosen by librarians in previous years, sometimes in previous decades. So there's some type of logic to what is included, even if I don't always agree with the choices. So once I've scanned the passages that I want, I run the resulting pages through Adobe Acrobat Pro and I make them into a single file, which I name using the publication date and the author's last name. For instance, 1935 Becker in the case of the book that I just ordered. I then run the OCR module on the PDF so that I'll be able to highlight it. And then I make a Zotero entry by capturing the information in the book's catalog page in the library catalog, and I attach the PDF to that. Yesterday, actually, I had to upgrade my Zotero storage plan to 6 gigabytes from 2 gigabytes. I suppose I could have gone into some of the folders that I'm not using currently and archived their PDFs onto a local hard drive or cloud storage. But I sort of prefer to have the PDFs available to me in Zotero. And I figured it was a good cause, so I sent them some more money. So once I had the PDFs in Zotero, I read them using my iPad, and I highlighted the interesting bits. The next step, of course, is to review those highlights and to make some notes. In one of the books, a 1937 volume called A History of Historical Writing by Harry Elmer Barnes, I found an interesting chapter about the World War and the clash of nationalism with scholarship. The author's contention was that the war deranged the otherwise objective perspective of academic historians with what he called a revival of patriotic enthusiasm. This was kind of extreme in Europe, where French historians said things like, "Lying is the national industry of the Germans, their very system of government. It is on lies that the Hohenzollerns established the Prussian power, and later, for the benefit of Prussia, the German power." So that's a bit extreme. Barnes says that H.G. Wells helped to produce anti-German propaganda in Britain. But even in the United States, he says, the most obsessed of the historical war propagandists, William Roscoe Thayer, was elected president of the American Historical Association. The reason for the American derangement, Barnes says, was that, quote, "the United States was in no real danger of attack. In the absence of the actual sound of real cannon fire, the American mob had to be stirred up by a cannonade of fierce but fictitious rhetoric. Propaganda was indispensable for building up American morale and bloodlust." And this is timely, since I've been reading a lot lately about propaganda, cultural hegemony, and common sense. Barnes goes on to say that for nearly a decade after the war, most of the men elevated to the presidency of the American Historical Association were those who had been conspicuous for their professional services to the Allies. This is an interesting charge, which he apparently wrote more about in an earlier book called In Quest of Truth and Justice in 1928. Barnes was apparently a big fan of the Germans, which made him initially the father of American revisionism in the 1920s, but later apparently also made him a Holocaust denier in the 1950s. So this guy Barnes is kind of an interesting character, and his career has an interesting arc that might merit a closer look. In any case, the fact that he went off the deep end later doesn't necessarily mean that he had no legitimate critiques in the early years. So that's something for me to think about. There are several other chapters of other books that I scanned and have been working through as well. So maybe I'll say something about the interesting bits of those and show my process again. In the meantime, this has been a quick look at one of the things that I'm doing in the library this summer. So I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thanks for listening, and I will see you again